Welcome back, everyone. Ready for another deep dive?
Always. What are we getting into today?
Well, this time, we're actually switching things up a bit.
Oh, how so?
Instead of our usual stack of research papers, we're going to be looking at a short story. A spooky one at that.
Interesting. I don't think we've ever done fiction before. What's the story?
It's called The Eclipse by Srinidhi Ranganathan. Found it over on bookspots.com.
The Eclipse. Sounds ominous. What's it about?
Well, it's about a haunted forest, the Forest of Eldermoon, to be exact.
Ooh, a haunted forest. I can already sense the chills. But, it makes you think.
About
about how even fiction, even something like a horror story, can reveal deeper truths about ourselves,
Exactly. That's what we're going to be exploring today. Beyond just the plot, we'll be digging into the themes, the characters, and what the author might be saying about fear, the unknown, those sorts of things.
It's a different kind of deep dive, that's for sure. But I think it could be really fascinating to see what we uncover.
Absolutely. So let's start with chapter 1. It's called Into the Wild.
Okay, Into the Wild. Sounds like the start of an adventure.
It is. We're introduced to our main character, Anja. She's described as, she's adventurous, drawn to the unknown, maybe even a little reckless. What do you make of that?
Adventurous, reckless. Sounds like she might be the type to get herself into trouble, especially in a haunted forest.
Right. It seems like the author is setting us up for a classic horror trope, the character who ignores warnings and rushes headfirst into danger.
It's a trope we see all the time, isn't it? But why do you think we're drawn to those stories, even though logically we know better?
It's that thrill of the unknown, I think. That part of us that wants to see what happens when someone tempts fate.
That's a good point. There's a tension there, right, between curiosity and fear. Like, we want to explore, but we also know there might be danger lurking around every corner.
And the author really emphasizes that tension through the setting. The Forest of Eldermoon is described in such vivid detail. Towering trees like cathedral corridors, sunlight filtering through the leaves.
It's almost like the forest itself becomes a character, right?
Exactly, and not a necessarily friendly one. There's a sense of unease from the beginning.
The whispers of the forest, the local legends about lost hikers. The author definitely knows how to create an atmosphere of suspense.
It's like a low hum of warning that steadily grows louder as the story progresses. And then things get even more unsettling when Anja is separated from her friends.
Ooh. Being alone in a haunted forest. Not a good situation.
Why do you think the author chose to separate her from her friends so early on?
Well, it definitely makes her more vulnerable, that's for sure. And it isolates her, forcing her and us, the readers, to confront that primal fear of being alone in the face of the unknown.
It's a powerful technique for ratcheting up the psychological tension. And speaking of tension, that's when she encounters the wolf, right? Right, but it's not just any wolf. It's described as a guardian of the shadows, almost like a supernatural entity.
Okay, so now we're getting into the truly spooky stuff. A guardian of the shadows. It's like it embodies that primal fear of the unknown, the feeling of being watched in the wilderness, that instinct that tells us we're not alone out there.
Especially in a place like the Forest of Eldermoon, with all its legends and whispers of strange occurrences. Even before she sees the wolf, the seeds of unease have already been planted.
And the darkness itself plays a role, doesn't it? It amplifies our fears, making us wary of what we can't see clearly. It's like our imaginations run wild, filling in the gaps with all sorts of terrifying possibilities.
Exactly, and that's exactly what the author is playing with here, weaving together the psychological and the supernatural to create a truly chilling experience for the reader. It's like the forest itself is a conduit for those fears, bringing them to life in a tangible form.
That's such a great point. And it makes you wonder what's going to happen next. Will Anja be able to overcome her fear and find her way out of the forest? Or will she be consumed by the darkness?
We'll have to delve deeper into the story to find out. But first, let's take a quick break. We'll be right back to continue our exploration of the eclipse and the unsettling truths it reveals about fear, the unknown, and the choices we make when faced with the shadows lurking just beyond the edge of the familiar.
It really makes you think about how our minds can be our own worst enemies sometimes, especially when we're in a situation that triggers those primal fears.
Absolutely. And that brings us to another classic element in horror storytelling, the abandoned cabin.
Oh yeah, those creepy, isolated cabins in the middle of nowhere. Always a recipe for some good scares.
Right. But why do you think those settings are so effective at evoking fear? It's not just about being alone in a dark place, is it?
I think it's also about that sense of intrusion, right? Like you're trespassing on someone else's space, even if they're long gone. And it makes you wonder what happened there, what secrets those walls might hold.
It's like those places hold the weight of the past, the echoes of lives lived and lost, and that can be really unsettling.
Definitely. And in the story, that abandoned cabin becomes a tangible representation of despair. It's filled with relics of the past, faded photographs, dusty furniture, that kind of thing. It really paints a picture of lives interrupted. And it's there, in that cabin, that Anja encounters another layer of the supernatural.
The ghostly girl. She's a fascinating character, isn't she? Not your typical screaming banshee.
Right. Instead of just being there to scare us, she actually warns Anja about the dangers ahead. Which makes you wonder, what is her purpose in the story?
Is she a victim herself, trapped in the forest because she didn't heed the warnings? Or is she something else, entirely a guide, maybe, trying to help Anja escape the same fate?
Ooh, interesting. It adds a whole other dimension to the story, doesn't it?
It really does. And it makes you think about the psychological aspect of it all. Like, maybe she represents survivor's guilt. Maybe she feels responsible for something that happened in the past, and that's why she's trapped there.
That's a really insightful interpretation. It also makes you wonder if the forest itself is a metaphor for any experience that leaves us feeling haunted, burdened by regret, or past choices.
It's like those experiences can leave an indelible mark on us, shaping our perceptions and influencing our decisions long after the event itself is over. Kind of like how the woods have claimed Anja and her friends.
Exactly. But, even with those warnings, Anja still faces a difficult dilemma. She wants to heed the ghostly girl's advice, but she also wants to find her friends.
That tension between self-preservation and loyalty, it's something we see a lot in horror stories. Like, how do we react when faced with extreme stress? Do we prioritize our own survival or risk everything for others?
It's a question that really makes you think about human nature, doesn't it? And about what really matters to us in the end.
And that brings us to the heart of Chapter 3, the choices we make. Anja is presented with an escape route, but it means leaving her friends behind.
Ooh, that's a tough one. That escape route becomes a symbol, doesn't it? The easy way out, the path of least resistance. But it also represents a betrayal of her loyalty to her friends.
And ultimately, she chooses to go back. It's a brave decision, even if it might be a little reckless.
Yeah, it shows that she's not just a thrill seeker. She actually cares about her friends. It makes you root for her, even though she's probably putting herself in more danger.
But remember, this isn't just a story about escaping a haunted forest. The wolf's final words, "The woods have claimed you," hint at something deeper, something more unsettling. Even if they manage to physically escape, will they ever truly be free of the forest's influence?
It's that lingering question that really makes the story stick with you, doesn't it? It suggests that they've been changed by the experience, marked by their encounter with the darkness. And maybe that darkness represents something within themselves as well, something they'll have to grapple with even after they leave the forest.
It's like the woods, the darkness, the fear, it all seeps into their very being, leaving a mark that they can't erase. Which is kind of a metaphor for life, isn't it? We all go through experiences that shape us, change us, and leave their mark, even if we try to forget them. And sometimes those experiences force us to confront the darkness within ourselves.
That's a powerful thought.
Yeah.
And it makes you appreciate the way the author uses this fictional story to explore some really deep, universal truths about the human experience.
It certainly does. So even though The Eclipse is a work of fiction, it offers us some valuable insights into the human condition.
It makes us think about our relationship with the unknown, the choices we make, and how those choices can ripple outward, impacting not just ourselves, but also the people around us.
It reminds us that sometimes the most terrifying monsters are the ones we create within ourselves, our fears, our doubts, our capacity for self-destruction.
And ultimately, it's about how we choose to face those monsters. Do we let them consume us? Or do we find a way to overcome them? It's a question we all have to answer at some point in our lives.
And that's a great segue into our next topic. We've talked about the themes, the symbolism, the psychological undercurrents, but what about the writing itself? What stood out to you in terms of how the author crafted this chilling tale?
Well, the imagery is definitely top-notch. I mean, the way the author describes the forest, the towering trees, those shifting shadows, that constant feeling of being watched. It's so vivid, so evocative. You can practically feel the characters' fear as they venture deeper into the woods.
Yes, and the pacing is perfect. The story unfolds slowly, gradually building that suspense and keeping you on the edge of your seat until the very end. It's like the author knows exactly how to play with our expectations and tap into our deepest fears.
Exactly. And the dialogue is great, too. It feels so natural and believable, which makes the characters even more relatable. Remember that scene before Anja enters the forest? The way the author captures the tension between her and her friends, it's like you can feel their worry, their excitement, and that underlying sense of dread.
Oh yeah, that scene was so well done. And that scene in the abandoned cabin, the way the author describes the decay, the musty air, the feeling of being watched, it's genuinely creepy. And then just when the tension is at its peak, the ghostly girl appears.
It's like the author is a master puppeteer pulling our strings and making us jump at every shadow. But it's not just about cheap scares. There's a real depth to this story. It makes you think, it makes you feel, and it stays with you long after you've finished reading.
So, having delved into this fictional world, what can we take away from this experience? What insights, if any, can we apply to our own lives?
Well, for me, it's a reminder that even in stories, even in horror stories, there are truths to be found. Truths about human nature, about the power of fear, and about the choices we make when faced with the unknown.
It encourages us to think about our own relationship with fear, doesn't it? How we confront it, how we overcome it, and how it shapes our actions and ultimately defines who we are.
Absolutely. And it reminds us that even in the face of fear, we have the power to choose courage, loyalty, and compassion. We can choose to be the heroes of our own stories, even when the darkness seems overwhelming. And sometimes the most terrifying journeys lead to the most profound self-discoveries.
It also makes you think about why these kinds of stories, especially the ones set in nature, resonate so deeply with us. Like, what is it about a haunted forest or a creepy cabin in the woods that really gets under our skin?
I think it goes back to, our evolutionary history. Like, for most of human existence, nature was both a provider and a threat.
Right. Like, imagine our ancestors living in a world where forests were full of predators, where darkness meant vulnerability.
Exactly. Those fears, those instincts, they became deeply ingrained in us, passed down through generations.
So, even though we might not be facing those same dangers today, those primal fears are still there, lurking in our subconscious.
Right. And horror stories, especially those set in nature, they sort of tap into those primal fears, allowing us to experience them in a safe, controlled way.
It's like a way of confronting our anxieties without actually putting ourselves in danger.
Yeah, it's like a mental workout for our fear muscles.
I like that. A mental workout for our fear muscles. So,
Yeah.
in a way, these stories can actually be cathartic, can't they?
Definitely. It's like you get to experience the adrenaline rush, the suspense, the thrill of facing the unknown, but you're safe, tucked away in your comfy chair.
Exactly. It's like facing your fears in a virtual reality simulation. But, even though The Eclipse is just a story, a fictional world, it still offers some valuable insights into the human condition, wouldn't you say?
Well, absolutely. I think it makes us think about our relationship with the unknown, the choices we make, and how those choices, they can have consequences, not just for ourselves, but for the people around us, kind of like the ripple effect.
And it also reminds us that sometimes the most terrifying monsters aren't the ones lurking in the shadows, but the ones we create within ourselves.
Our fears, our doubts, our own capacity for self-destruction. That's a scary thought.
It is a scary thought, but also a very profound one. And, that's what makes this story so compelling. It's not just about cheap scares. It's about exploring those deeper truths about ourselves, about what it means to be human.
Exactly. And in the end, I think that's what we're all searching for, right? Those stories, those experiences that help us understand ourselves and the world around us a little bit better.
Well said. And I think The Eclipse definitely does that. It's a reminder that even in the darkest of places, even in the face of fear, we have the power to make choices, to find courage, and to shape our own destinies.
Yeah. And that's a powerful message, don't you think?
Yeah.
That we can all carry with us, even when we leave the Forest of Eldermoon behind.
Absolutely. Well, folks, that brings us to the end of another deep dive. It's been a fascinating journey into the world of horror, exploring not just the thrills and chills, but also the deeper meanings and insights that these stories can offer. We hope you've enjoyed it.
And we hope it's given you something to think about, something to ponder, as you navigate the shadows and the unknowns in your own lives.
Until next time, stay curious and keep exploring.